Just have to wait for that. Tonight, our topic is sorting fact from fiction, understanding barriers and opportunities for youth voting. As many of you may be aware, our league has initiated a program for Essex County high schools called Why Voting Matters to encourage young people to register and to vote. So we're looking forward to learning more about the barriers and opportunities from our speaker tonight. I'm pleased to welcome Kelly Siegel-Stechler, a senior researcher at the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or CIRCLE, at Tufts University. This is a nonpartisan research center that serves as a go-to for data on youth voting and civic education. She is primarily focused on projects that advance civic learning and development in K-12 education, as well as questions related to youth political and electoral engagement. Before joining CIRCLE, Kelly received her doctorate from the Johns Hopkins University School of Education, where she studied civic development and political socialization in schools. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Kelly worked in educational programming and youth outreach and engagement at the Interfaith Center of New York, the Louis August Jonas Foundation, and the United Nations Foundation. As she speaks, please remain muted, but you can certainly put questions into the chat, which we can address at the end. Welcome, Kelly, and she'll share her slides now.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Let me get my slides up for you. All right. Great. So wonderful. Sorry. So thank you so much for that introduction. I'm Kelly Siegel-Stechler. I'm really excited to be here and share a little bit about myths and facts about youth voting and thinking more expansively about opportunities for youth and ways that we can support and encourage young people to participate in elections and recognizing sort of maybe historically why that's been challenging for them in the past. So as you heard, CIRCLE is a nonpartisan research center. We're based at Tufts University outside of Boston. And our work is really focused on thinking about youth civic engagement broadly. We think not just about youth voting, but about civics education, about youth involvement in movements, youth leadership, and political activism, and a lot of different ways that young people can get involved in their communities and in the world around them. We also increasingly are focused on taking a systemic approach and trying to eliminate systemic barriers to voting and increasing equity in turnout among young people and diverse groups. So you all know this, but just to give some background, why does voting matter? Right, so from a really theoretical perspective, we need people to vote in order to maintain a democratic system. We rely on the idea, right, our government is founded on the idea that it is by and for the people. It's a republic where officials represent and are held accountable by a public that votes for them. And from a practical standpoint, when that's not happening, right, it sort of erodes trust in our democracy. When people don't turn out, they tend to sort of think that institutions don't work for them. They think that their votes don't matter, and then they don't vote, and it sort of creates this downward spiral of turnout. And what happens is that when you have low voter turnout, you end up with an unrepresentative electorate. You end up hearing from basically two kinds of people, right? Those who are most advantaged and who have the most going for them in our current system, which deepens inequality, and those people who have the most extreme political views and care very deeply and therefore are more likely to show up. And so you end up with sort of a more partisanship and sort of extreme sort of polarization over time. So we need everybody to vote in order to have a functional democracy. And more specifically, we need young people to vote too, right? To support our democracy, to make sure that that democracy represents the communities that they are a part of, that it represents them as individuals and their interests and the needs of the younger generation and the policies that matter to them, and to support an equitable representation writ large, that our democracy looks like the people who live there, right? Young people are more diverse in a number of ways than older generations, and making sure that the voices of those diverse audiences that live in the United States are represented by our electorate and the people that we vote into office as representatives is really important. So how are we doing? Unfortunately, the US is not doing that great. Nationally, our voter turnout has been pretty low over the last, over this century. This would be these voting rates usually that hover around 67%, 2/3 turnout in, or 60% in presidential years, 40% in midterm years, is sort of middling to bottom among other developed democracies around the world. It is, however, up over the last few cycles, which is good news, and we will see if that continues moving forward into the 2020s. You know, youth are similar. Since young people received the right to vote in the late 70s, 18-year-olds, we've started tracking youth turnout since that time, and it generally hovers between 20 and 25%. It is up over the last few election cycles, so these are midterm years. You can see our national estimate of youth turnout was 27% for 2022. But those numbers are lower, right, than we saw on the national scale. In New Jersey specifically, youth turnout is up just like it is nationally, but it's down from the last two election cycles. So interestingly, New Jersey wasn't doing so great in terms of youth turnout, and then in 2020, around the pandemic, the state decided to send everybody a ballot who was registered to vote, and it increased youth turnout hugely. They were actually the #1 youth turnout state in the country in 2020. And when New Jersey didn't do that in 2022, sort of fell back to the middle of the pack, which should be a clue that access and accessibility for young people is really important. And policy can play a big role in making voting possible for young people. So we'll get to our first myth, which is that young people don't vote. And there's a reason that we've been told that this is true, right? We do see a really strong correlation between age and voting behavior. As people get older, they vote at higher and higher rates. And there are a bunch of theoretical explanations that researchers use to try to explain this. One idea is that young people have less established voting patterns. We know that voting is habit forming over the course of a lifetime. And so it sort of takes a little while to ramp up and build that habit. One popular theoretical explanation is apathy, that young people don't care, or they have a tendency towards nonconformism that tends to fade with age, or that they don't have the knowledge necessary for participation. But actually what we see is that to a large extent, this voting gap by age is predominantly a registration gap. Young people are registered to vote at much lower rates than older folks, but among those who are registered, they turn out to vote at pretty comparable rates. It's pretty, you know, they're slightly lower, but it's not as much of a noticeable gap. And increasingly, research is sort of telling us that this turnout gap is really a registration gap, and that for the most part, right, there's a study from 2020 that says almost the entirety of that registration gap among young people can be explained by a lack of residential stability among young people. So in the United States, we have a place-based registration system where you register to vote based on your address. And as a result, we see a really strong correlation between voting and residential stability. Both mobility, right? How often people move, and security, which we sort of think about as homeowners versus renters. How likely are you to be able to stay in that home over time? And as you can see here, this is from some census data. The longer you live in your house, the more likely you are to turn out. But that's mostly true for people that are able to own their home. Among renters, they do have some sort of bump to turn out the longer they stay in one place, but it's much less pronounced. And so housing mobility is a huge predictor of our ability to vote, right? It leads, when we move, we need to update registration, which comes with administrative paperwork, deadlines that require significant lead time. And so among people who have recently moved, we tend to see lower turnout rates overall. And this appears to be a problem, even controlling for other factors, right? So there's a bunch of research that looks at things like areas with high numbers of evictions, around the foreclosure crisis in 2008, for example. And it appears not only that housing mobility reduces your chance of voting, but that impact is even more pronounced among people who were already less likely to vote for other reasons, because they were younger, because they were less educated or had lower incomes, right? All of these things that might predict lower turnout rates. Housing instability is really contributing to their lower turnout overall. And this is really important, right? Homeownership has been a long-standing indicator of socioeconomic success in the United States. And when we tie that to our ability to vote, it means that we're sort of making voting even harder for people who are already struggling in other ways as an indicator for this, right? So other factors that are tied to community housing and instability tend to impact turnout at a community level as well. So when you have a lack of housing, you have a lot of housing shortages in neighborhoods, you also tend to see lower turnout because you have less residential stability. The other thing that's related to age, but is one of the strongest predictors we have of who votes, is education. So educational attainment in the United States is kind of like the most strong predictor that we have. The more education that you have, the more likely you are to vote. And young people are often still in the process of figuring out what education looks like for them, what they want to do, what they want to study, whether they want to continue on to college or to some other post-secondary option. And so they haven't really settled on what their educational outcomes look like. And right, education is also associated to some extent with that housing mobility, whether you're moving to go to college or moving out of your parents' house and you don't have a permanent address for a while. Around 18, when people age into voting, is a really unstable time in young people's lives. And it tends to contribute to this challenge of getting to the polls and turning out to vote. Right, the same inequality that we see by education persists just among young people. So over time, we have seen that there's a consistent gap among just youth in turnout. And this really plays out not just, in terms of, this is a challenge for equity, because young people who go to college, who are on college campuses, tend to be the people that get talked about and thought about when we think about youth voting. They receive more funding, they receive more attention, they get more support from their universities or from people working on turnout and get out the vote campaigns to go to colleges to think about college students, much more so than non-college youth. And that tends to lead to persistent inequities in what young people are getting counted and going to the polls. And it also contributes to other major inequities in youth voting, like disparities by race. Just like with education, over time, we've seen pretty consistent gaps in terms of racial groups and turnout, because young people of color have been much less supported to get to the polls. There are a few notable exceptions to this, like you'll see a surge in Black youth voting during the Obama era, which was really exciting. And in recent years, we've actually seen a really big increase in Asian American young people turning out. We will see if that trend persists over the next few cycles, but there's a lot of effort being made to close these gaps, but they do continue to persist over time. And it's predominantly, when we talk about young people, we think about young people, we're generally thinking about young white voters who go to college. And that's not the whole story of who we need to be reaching and who we should be thinking about. So my second myth is that young people don't care. And this is just simply not true. Young people do care a lot about a lot of different issues. So this is from our 2022 post-election survey. We asked young people what their sort of top concerns were at the time. And in many ways, they care about the same things that older generations care about, right? They care about the economy, rising costs of healthcare and housing, job wage stagnation, but they also care about a lot of these sort of perennial youth issues that are really important to them. Things like abortion, climate change, and gun violence prevention tend to be really motivating factors for young people, and things that they consistently say again and again matter quite a bit to them. But young people are not a monolith. They experience and prioritize issues differently based on their diverse identities, especially things like their education level, gender, and race are really strong predictors of what issues young people tend to care about and what matters to them. Often in the media, we will see reports, especially there's a huge coverage of young people caring a lot about abortion in our last election cycle. Around 2020, we heard a lot about young people being invested in Black Lives Matter and concern over racism and policing. We hear a lot about young people being interested in climate change. But again, a lot of these things are really defined by young people's identities and their experiences in life, right? So young people who go to college are much more likely to say that they care about the climate. Young women are more likely than young men to select abortion as one of their top issues. And Black youth were twice as likely to select racism as an issue that they really cared about compared to their peers. So there's a lot of variation in what matters to them, what they're paying attention to, and the things that drive them and that they care about. At the same time, many young people report that they have lack of opportunity to get involved with and hear about or learn about the things that they are invested in. Right? It's not so much a lack of apathy or a lack of interest or apathy as it is a lack of opportunity. We see varying levels of ability to engage in and participate in elections. Often when young people try to get involved, they don't hear or they don't receive sort of positive feedback from the older people or more established volunteers in their communities. And it makes it harder for them to get involved in things they care about. So for example, on this chart, this is an example of communities and institutions not meeting youth interest with opportunities. So the darker green and darker blue bars show youth who were interested but did not see opportunity or an inclusive and welcoming opportunity, right? So these bars, especially opportunities to volunteer for a campaign or get involved in a registration drive, are much lower than youth who actually had the opportunity to do those things. And as a country, generally speaking, we don't create processes that help youth learn and get involved at an early age how to participate, even if they're not yet 18. Finding ways to sort of spark that interest, to give them opportunities to get involved and to build on once they become voters and adults, because they've practiced and they've had an opportunity to follow through the things that they care about as young people. All right. And then my last myth that I want to cover is that youth votes don't matter. That even if youth do turn out, right? Their numbers aren't huge, they're a smaller generation, and their voting doesn't really impact the outcomes of elections. Well, that is very much not true, especially because right now, youth in the United States are strongly partisan. I just want to remind people, I think we have a tendency to talk about young people as voting Democratic as though that has always been the case and is like a fundamental truth of youth. That's not the case. That's a relatively new phenomenon. It's been growing over time, over the last 20 years or so. But even, for example, in Massachusetts, where I live, young people are less partisan than the older adult population. So it's not necessarily as cut and dried as you might think. But that being said, because young people care so much about these core issues and because they are increasingly voting as a bloc, they really have the potential to impact national and state level elections. So if you look at the map on the left is sort of the outcome of the 2020 presidential election. And then on the right is what just young people look like. So if only young people voted in 2020, this is what our electoral map would have been, which is a very different picture than what we see on the left, right? And it's not just that young people are only voting Democratic. There are certainly states and places where they swing the other way, or they are much more bipartisan, but they do tend to look different than the overall population. And they can even, as a result, decide key tight races. There are a number of tight states where the sort of net youth votes for Biden ended up being larger than the margin of victory overall in that state, including Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, right? So when young people are reached out to, when they do feel invested and they turn out to vote, they really have the power to make a huge impact, to change the course of our political landscape, and to make sure that their voices are heard and respected. So youth do have power, they do listen, they do vote, and when we talk to them and we engage them and we give them opportunities to be heard, they can make a massive impact. So now I want to get to what are those barriers? What prevents youth from registering and voting? On a theoretical level, there are sort of three core reasons that people say they don't vote. The first is what is sort of the traditionally thought of issue of young people is disillusionment and disinterest, right? My vote doesn't matter. I don't like any of the options. It's not important to me to vote. And there are certainly young people who feel that way. But there are also other challenges that we can address and we can pay attention to that can help improve turnout among youth, right? So part of that is lack of information, not knowing how to navigate our electoral system, not having access to a media environment and landscape that pays attention to them, or not hearing from campaigns or parties that are local to them to know who the candidates are that they need to be thinking about and invested in. And then the last issue are logistical issues, right? Policy issues that make it difficult to get to the polls, or the challenges of their day-to-day lives that don't necessarily mesh well with the electoral system as it exists. Missing registration deadlines, challenges of transportation and getting to and from a voting place, not being able to get time off work or find childcare to get to the polls. All of these things add up to sort of the logistical challenges of actually making it from your house to the voting booth on election day. And youth tend to follow most other groups when it comes to these things, except that they are more likely to say that they have challenges of information than older generations. So you do hear from young people who say it's not that important to them, right? So in this circle on the right, we see almost a third of young people who said that they didn't vote, said that they didn't think it mattered or it wasn't important to them. this 40% here, 38% are people who were too busy or forgot. And that might sound like apathy, but it's also usually a logistical challenge as well. I had too much going on. Getting to the polling place is a challenge for me, and so I couldn't make it happen this year. But fully, this 21% of young people who said that they didn't have enough information to vote, that is remarkable, because among adults or the general population, that number is usually much smaller. And so making sure that young people have access to information, that they know who is running, that they know why their votes matter, that they've been given a way to understand and be walked through the voting process, is really, really important. And a huge part of that lack of information is because people don't invest in or think to reach out to youth. In the 2020 election, less than 40% of youth said that they heard from a major party. Compared to older generations, that is very small, right? So across the board, less than half of young people are hearing from people about the election, that are, right, people aren't canvassing at their doors, people aren't sending them mailers or showing up, or talking to them and specifically telling them that their vote matters, that it matters to a party or a candidate or a local organization, that they show up and that they make their voice heard. And that's a really important thing when we want young people to show up and get to the polls. They also might not have the opportunity to learn about voting in school, and might not have sort of the background information that they need in order to be prepared to show up at the polls in their first election cycle. This is especially true for youth from rural areas who are generally less exposed to information and opportunities about voting in elections than their urban and suburban peers. So what can we do about it? This is the big thing, right? So the first thing is that, right, policy does matter. We do know, just like we saw in New Jersey, that the choices we make about how we make elections accessible to voters is really important. Both registration policies, like same-day voter registration, is the #1 policy for promoting youth turnout. It is more effective for young people than any other policy. And it is a policy that New Jersey does not currently have in place. And so it's definitely something that you could be thinking about. Election day policies like early voting, extended poll hours, vote by mail, the ways that people actually cast their vote are really important. And then this last sort of way we think about policy is voter eligibility, who gets to vote. And I personally would love to make a pitch for lowering the voting age to 16. I think that would be a really important step for a few reasons. From a researcher's perspective and sort of based on evidence, like I said before, turning 18 is a hugely destabilizing time in a lot of young people's lives. They're often leaving home, they're making major choices, they're learning to be adults for the first time. Many of them are living on their own for the first time, navigating a new job or being in charge of their education for the first time. They are very housing unstable. It's just a really difficult moment in our lives. And to, on top of all that, expect a young person to vote for the first time and to find the time and space in their busy, complicated, challenging life at that sort of developmental stage is really, really hard. And that's why we see the lowest turnout rates among 18 and 19-year-olds. When you're 16, however, generally speaking, most young people still live at home with a parent. They are residentially stable in the same home that they've been in, usually for a longer period of time. And they usually go to a public school that could register them to vote and offer information about making it through that first cycle before they turn 18, right? And so there's actually some experimental evidence now from Germany that finds that lowering the voting age to 16, rather than just adding a bunch of young people who never turn out to vote to the rolls, actually increased youth turnout, because those young people who were 16 to 18, who were going through their first voting cycle, while they were still at home, turned out at much higher rates because they had all of these supports around them. And then once they had done it once, right, like once you sort of have built that habit, you know what voting looks like, you've seen it happen, you understand the process, it's much easier to vote in subsequent elections. And so it is my personal hope and belief that lowering the voting age could actually have really positive effects on youth turnout, and it's something that we should think about trying. So that's just my quick pitch for Vote 16. But we also know that policy alone is not enough, right? Part of the reason that we would need all of this, like young people need supports around them to vote. And the United States has not sufficiently created, invested in, or sustained opportunities to support how diverse young people learn to participate in elections, register, and vote. And this really requires a paradigm shift in thinking about how we prepare young people for elections, what we expect of them, and how we build a community of support around them to get them to the polls. This is a framework that we have called Circle Growing Voters, which really is thinking about changing how we do elections based on the research that we've done and understanding what the challenges and barriers are that young people face, right? So right now, we basically ignore young people as voters until they turn 18. And then we contact them in the few months before the election. We try everything we can in these small targeted areas. And then we hope they turn up to the polls, and we're disappointed when they don't, right? We don't think about systematically preparing and educating them towards that process. It's right now, voter outreach tends to be very transactional. It tends to be very targeted to specific geographies where we think there's a chance for a party flip. And it happens only every 2 years in a very short period of time before the election, as opposed to a growing voters approach, which thinks about building an ecosystem of support, access, and exposure around young people that supports them throughout their civic development, to sort of be ready to know what's coming, and where voting is sort of the end of the story instead of the beginning. It's something that they naturally know how and are ready to do when they hit 18, because it's been a part of the culture and community and the ecosystem around them while they were still in school. And one thing that you can do in Montclair specifically is think about mapping your community ecosystem and the assets that you all have, and figuring out how LWE fits into this broader ecosystem. You've already done so much work to identify places that you specifically can be helpful and supportive, partners that you can work with, and thinking about this longer term trajectory of reaching young people, getting them involved to understand why voting matters and why it matters not just to them, but to their broader community, and supporting them and preparing them for a lifetime of voter engagement. So thank you so much.
That's great. I'll leave the applause, the mute applause for you, Kelly. Thanks so much. That was so interesting. And I learned a bunch of stuff, but it reinforced, I think, some of the stuff that we're doing that I think we're on the right track to, but we've got a long way to go. Let me first start, because a couple people have put stuff in the chat. So let me just start with those comments in the chat first, and then we'll open it up to discussion. Pat asks, when the 2020 youth voter turnout results by state were released, she said she called and asked if the results could be supplied by county. And I'm assuming this, she was contacting in New Jersey. She was told it was in the works, but to date, she hasn't gotten it. And when she searched, she hasn't been able to get it. Has it been completed, or can we do a search on the website to find out what the results were in our state by county?
I am not sure that we have that. I don't know, 2020, I did not come to Circle until 2021, so I missed that window. I
Okay.
know we have acquired the county level data for 2022, but it has not
Okay.
yet been processed.
Ah.
I will
So
check
how,
in.
so
with
how
our
do we just, when we, if
communications
we're interested as a league, interested in getting, let's say the 2022 data, how do we go about getting that? Do we just go on your website?
So we will have a data tool that you'll be able to look at a county level. I think our goal is to have that like early fall, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
I will follow up with our communications manager and figure out what the timeline is, and I can reach out to you, Donna, and let you know.
Great. And I'll share it with everyone who's registered. If anybody, wants to stay in touch on any of this, they obviously can just drop me an email. John asks, when you showed the slide of, the breakdowns between Democratic and Republican registrations among youth, the percentages would indicate that means that only 2% are independent. Would that be true?
So that's their actual vote choice, not their party registration.
Not their registration. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They voted for. So only 2%. So that means that they didn't vote for either then. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, we have Alexia on, who's graduated high school in 2021. She asked, do you think including lessons about voter registration in high school history classes can come to be? She's wondering why voting was never touched upon, especially in history classes, all throughout her high school experience. What? Alexia, I'm shocked. I'm shocked. I mean,
Yes, this is hugely important and something
we
that
have laws that civics education, we have women here at the league who have put together whole programs for that. I mean, that's so interesting to me, Alexia, that you feel that you're about to graduate from, you graduated from high school just recently, and you feel like you never really were exposed to lessons about voting. I think that goes to show, even in a so-called progressive state like New Jersey, and it may be more the practice, if it's done in an abstract way or in a very high level way without the, concrete way of literally how do you vote, the mechanics of voting, why should you vote, etc. It may not resonate. So thank you, Alexia. And also thank you, Alexia, for being on tonight and trying to learn about this. This is my question. Okay. Is there a difference in youth voter turnout in states that have more restrictive versus expanded voting rules?
Yes.
Okay.
And we do see that in states that have consistently invested in policies and education to support youth voting over time, that they have much higher turnout rates. So the sort of golden child in this area is Colorado, which over the last decade or so has made huge strides in reaching young people, right? So Colorado has all male elections. They have automatic voter registration. So when you get your driver's license, you are automatically registered to vote. And a ballot is mailed to your house automatically every single election. And it's very accessible, right? So even if I'm off at college on the other side of the state, if my parents receive my ballot at home, I have 2 months to get home to figure out how to fill it out. It's much easier. I could put it in any mailbox. My parents could even drop it off for me if I come home for the weekend or they go up to visit. It's much easier when you have this sort of flexible timeline and sort of automatic process to make sure that those kinds of things happen. So we do see, when you take the time and sort of invest in lots of different ways to think about improving and expanding access, that we do see higher youth turnout in those kinds of states. Michigan is another state. Washington is a state that has all male elections. And we do see a correlation in those places between higher youth turnout rates.
And of course, then we can also use our own example here in New Jersey during the pandemic when we went to all male vote ballots. You said that we had the highest youth turnout in the US, which goes to show you that it is, but as soon as it was rescinded, we went back to, you have to request vote by mail ballot, the rates dropped off again. So it does lead credence to the point that you're making, that it's this issue of accessibility. So to that end, you also mentioned that Circle and recommends same-day voter registration. And that's something that, and Doris points out in her comment, that that's one of a big priority for us right now as a league in New Jersey. All of our leagues are working on that. But interestingly, Kelly, I've never heard the argument for it as the way to really address this youth voting gap, that it's a huge way to really close that, which is tied to the residential instability thing. I think that's a very compelling argument because it makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm going to use that in one of the postcards that I'm going to write. We're writing postcards right now to our legislators.
Yeah, when you have you have to register, and then you have a gap, like a deadline, and then you have an election, you essentially have to mobilize young people twice.
Right.
And you assume that they automatically are going to be living in the same place when they registered and when they vote. And the more housing unstable you are, like that, I know it sounds like, oh, of course you're going to live in the same place. It's only a couple of months, or it's only, but that can be really challenging for a lot of young people and unstable low-income folks.
Yes.
And so same-day registration pretty much guarantees, no matter where you are, what's going on in your life, you only have to show up that one time and you can still vote, you can still be counted.
Right.
And that makes a huge difference for young people.
Right. Pat says that she has a program in her league that we are well familiar with, which has been very successful, called Energizing Young Voters. And she has a member who's an extremely active person in lowering the voting age to 16 in New Jersey municipal and Board of Elections races. She says she's very articulate, and she thinks she could be convinced to talk to leagues that are interested. And I think we as leagues should take you up on that, because I think that you touched also on the lowering the voting age to 16, and that actually came up for a vote in the House. I'm sure you're well aware, in 2021, and was voted down. The New Jersey delegation, we teach this in our little course, actually split on that. Half of our delegation voted for it, half of it voted, against it. And it's interestingly, when we go into high schools, there are a lot of kids who are not necessarily for it, because they think that 16-year-olds may not be informed, enough to vote, et cetera. And sometimes I feel like saying, well, there are not many adults that are very highly informed when they're casting their vote either. So, you'd be in good company. But the lowering the voting age to 16, I agree with you. I think 16-year-olds are certainly could be mature enough to vote, and to get them into that habit at that age without all the other stressors, as you were saying, when you're junior and senior going on, it's almost a perfect age to introduce them and get them. And once they're into the habit, as we know in our leagues work, if you get into the habit of voting, then you're most likely going to continue it. So,
yeah, I want to talk. So Louise asked, why 16 and not another age? So this is a really good question. I think 16, to me, right, that's a full election cycle. It ensures that before you turn 18, like, you've got a whole extra election cycle, and sort of guarantees that when you are still in high school, you will get to vote in one primary election, or general, like, 2-year national election. Is sort of the reason why a full 16 and not 17 or anything like that. 14, I don't have a problem with 14-year-olds voting, but people get very squirrely about who is a child and who is, like, there's some sort of fine line that happens in the 14 to 21 age where people start to ask a lot of questions about, are you really mature enough? And I think a lot of people recognize that 16-year-olds now often have a lot of other legal rights. They can work more hours. There's all these statutory laws around 16. A lot of 16-year-olds can get married depending where you live. And so people are much more comfortable with that number. Whereas 14, I think, still feels like a child to a lot of people. And it's a real challenge. Adolescence is a very weird time. We don't have clear boundaries around it in a lot of ways. And so it's just really tricky to pick the right age and the right time. I personally think a lot of 14-year-olds that I know would be great voters, but that's sort of where we are as a society right now.
Right, right. John is asking, is it true and can it be shown that states in which youth participation is relatively high produces actual policy results in alignment with the priorities cited by youth? If it's true, that might address concerns that it doesn't matter. You know,
that is a great question, and
is
something that we at Circle could absolutely tackle and probably should.
Yeah, I think that would be very compelling.
At a national level, this is a perennial challenge, is that young people often say, we showed up, we turned out, and then none of the priorities that we cared about seem to matter. We do sort of see, it seems very much that Biden made a real effort to sort of reward and pay attention to youth turnout in 2020 by sort of his executive orders around student debt, by changing, sort of decriminalizing marijuana and trying to move away from people being incarcerated for marijuana offenses at the national level. So it does feel like we're starting to see at a national scale some recognition that young people have issue priorities and things that they care about. Part of the challenge is that young people, right, like I said, are not a monolith. The things that they care about really vary. And often the things that they care about most, especially thinking about climate, is one of the sort of stickiest, hardest to address issues right now. And young people consistently get frustrated and sort of have a feeling that they don't care. And so one thing I will say is that often you see individual Congress people from districts with high youth populations or high youth turnouts will adopt issues that reflect those youth or positions that reflect those youth priorities. And it can be really worth looking at individual legislators that have constituencies and having young people look at who their legislator is and whether they think they're reflective of young people's goals, especially in areas with really big universities or other sort of large youth populations. You do tend to see some of that coming out.
Makes sense. And Pat is just reminding everyone that in New Jersey, we do have a state education law which requires voter registration and voter education in every school, not just public schools. And prior to them graduating from high school, and the superintendent needs to sign off on that. So, you know, that is also a cudgel that we can use as a league, not a cudgel, but as a reminder that, you know, this helps fulfill when we go in to do voter registration and voter education and civics programs, that it helps the schools meet that obligation. And she's also reminding the league has a toolkit on this that we can use to reach out to schools. John's asking again, does 16 require a constitutional amendment for federal elections?
At the federal level,
yes, but not at the local level, right?
Yes, you could legalize, you could lower the voting age in a municipality, for example. Different entities have different laws. Usually it might require an amendment to the state constitution, but not every state constitution. It's really sort of locally specific in a lot of ways. For example, here in Massachusetts, we have a local town that a few years ago voted to allow non-US citizens to vote in local elections because there are a lot of foreign-born folks here with all the higher ed. Many of them have kids in the local school systems and want to be able to vote in school board elections. And so a local town passed an ordinance to allow that to happen, but they have to get approval from the state Secretary of State to actually change the policy. And that's not happening. And so there's a lot of like weird bureaucratic things that happen at the state and local level that can make it really challenging. And so that's often why you see this push to just do it for everybody at the federal level, because then you can avoid a lot of the gridlock that comes from these really hyper-specific local cases.
Right. Any other comments or questions? I mean, just you can unmute yourselves now, and any other final comments or questions? I mean, I think everything that I heard tonight, Kelly, was very intuitive, that it made a lot of sense to me. And I'm very gratified that it reinforces to me that the directions and the programs and the way that the leagues are trying to go about it is the right way. So it's always good to have an independent, both working in the same, for the same thing, coming to the same conclusions. You're doing it fact-based, which is, helpful for us to hear about. Any other comments that anybody else has?
It was very informative, and my goodness, it just got my brain running all over the place.
Great.
And you gave a lot of good information, and hopefully we can, as a league, can do something with all of this,
Yes.
to assist everyone.
Yes, yes. And I mean, I was just thinking too about, offering more, trying to go to the high schools more upfront about getting them more involved and helping them with our own voter registration drives, inviting them, you don't have to be 18 to vote, to register somebody else to vote. You can be a 15-year-old and work a voter registration table, that kind of thing. And there's no reason why they can't feel like they're part of this getting people to vote, register to vote process, and even get out the vote. Louise, were you raising your hand? Just unmute. Are you still muted?
I'm unmuted. Maybe 3 hours ago, I spoke to my state senator, Corrado, and I asked her about what about the chances for same-day voting.
Yes.
She said it's not moving, according to her.
Yeah.
At the moment, and she said that we should take it up with the Secretary of State. How do we do that?
Tahisha Way, yeah, yeah, we should. I think we need to talk about that at our convention in June. How can we, as the states and all the leagues together, put pressure on Murphy and Tahisha Way on this? It's like the last linchpin of what would make New Jersey, probably one of the most progressive states, other than Colorado, maybe, in terms of voter access. So I think we should definitely, Louise, talk about that more within other, our league network. Any other thoughts? I know it's coming up on 8. I don't want to hold up anyone. Kelly, thank you so much again. We very much appreciate it. And I hope that we can remain in touch and talk to you again on this subject. And everyone's thanking you. Thank you, everyone.
For having me.
All right. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you so much.
And I hope I see our members in May 10th, hopefully at our annual meeting. See you then. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.